Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live at the Library. Please welcome the library's Director of the Literary Initiatives Office, Clay Smith.
Hi, everybody. We're thrilled you're here. We hope you received the email earlier today that our writer, James Kirchick, has COVID. So he's joining us on screen. He's feeling okay, but our great moderator, Jonathan Capehart, is here with us and will join us in just one moment. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about Live at the Library. This conversation tonight is part of a new series we've started. And it takes place every Thursday night, and we keep this building, the Jefferson Building, open until 8 p.m., and there's food and drink. We want you to know that this library and this space are yours, and we want you to come back. So next Thursday, we're featuring the Grammy-winning quintet Ranky Tanky. On June 23rd, Annie Leibovitz will be here talking about her latest book, Wonderland, which is a collection of her fashion photography. And on June 30th, Washington Nationals pitcher Sean Doolittle, who is a great reader, will be in conversation with the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, about his life as a reader. And our beloved summer film series starts on the southeast lawn of the Jefferson Building, right around here, on July 7th at sundown with a screening of Top Gun. So, stop me if you guessed what our first film was going to be for the summer film series. Tonight's conversation is a celebration of Pride Month. The Library of Congress has all kinds of fascinating LGBTQ+ collections, some of which you'll hear about tonight, and James Kirchick did some of his research here, so we're proud of that. We have a lot of holdings from the homophile and early gay liberation movement, such as the archives of Frank Kameny and Lily Vincennes, and extensive collections about Walt Whitman, Audre Lorde, Oscar Wilde, Adrienne Rich, Alvin Ailey, Leonard Bernstein, and the AIDS Memorial Quilt Collection. We do have a few things in the library that are not about queer people, but it's just like 3. So, no, I'm kidding. Don't go home and tell your friends that this guy from the Library of Congress said that they only have gay stuff at the Library of Congress. Don't do that. So let me tell you a little bit about James and Jonathan. James Kirchick has written about human rights, politics, and culture from around the world. A columnist for Tablet Magazine, a writer-at-large for Airmail, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, he is the author of The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. Kirchick's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement. A graduate of Yale with degrees in history and political science, he lives here in Washington. And obviously, he's here to talk to us tonight about his latest book, Secret City, The Hidden History of Washington. And Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Jonathan Capehart has been a member of the Washington Post editorial board since 2007. He writes about politics and social issues, hosts the podcast Capehart, and anchors the weekly Washington Post live show First Look, which is also streamed on The Choice, MSNBC. Capehart is also an MSNBC contributor and the anchor of The Sunday Show with Jonathan Capehart. And just a final reminder, James's book is for sale at the information desk just right outside of the auditorium, so we encourage you to head there. So let's welcome James and Jonathan.
I can't hear you, Jonathan. No.
We rehearsed this. It was
Now
so.
I can hear you.
Aha.
Now I can hear you. Now I can
Okay,
hear you.
great. Now I can hear myself
Sorry about that.
as well. Jamie, thank you very much for doing this. Excuse me. Thank you all very much for being here. As you can see, if you have not seen Secret City, it's a big book. and the pages are thin, and the lines between the pages are thin, but it is packed with information. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the book, Jamie. Really, it is spectacular. And I want to start the conversation at the end of the book. And it is on page 652, right? It's 654 pages. And that's not including the notes. On page 652, you write, to the extent that Americans have rejected this hostility towards the LGBTQ community, it's thanks in large part to a small yet diverse group of intrepid individuals who lived in its capital city, where they laid the groundwork for a revolution in consciousness. Most narratives of the movement for gay equality exalt an uprising by the patrons at a New York City bar, the martyrdom of a San Francisco city councilor, and the activism against an orange juice spokeswoman in Miami. All of these played a significant role, but the spark for the revolution was lit, and its flame was tended in Washington, D.C. by a motley procession of once secret people. Talk more, because this is one of the big themes in the book, that Washington, even though all these things happen around the country, it's in Washington, you believe and feel strongly, where the movement really took off.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming. Thanks to everyone in the audience. And thank you especially to the Library of Congress, where I spent many months buried in the amazing stacks, reading and using the microfilm machines and the whole resources of the library, the archives. I really want to thank the Library of Congress. It's an amazing institution, and we're very lucky to have it. So yes, I believe that Washington is really the unsung hero of the broader movement for gay equality in this country. And there are several reasons for that. One, I think this is just a very gay city, just demographically. And it always really has been, at least in the modern era. And I trace that back to the New Deal, when this city really became a city. It transformed from being just a kind of swampy southern town into a real global capital. And then with World War II as well, you have a lot of gay people moving here during the New Deal. And the story of gay people in 20th century America is largely a story of urbanization. It's people fleeing small towns and moving to various cities. San Francisco doesn't really become that way, the kind of reputation that we know of San Francisco. It doesn't really happen until the 70s. New York, it's more, I think, in the 50s. But with Washington, it's really earlier. It's in the 1930s. But it's sort of a paradox, right? Because as we'll discuss, Washington was not exactly a very welcoming place to gay people in the way that San Francisco or New York were. But it had a lot of gay people coming and working in government. But then I think the real main reason I make that case, that point that you read in the conclusion, it's really the role of the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C., which is really the first sustained gay rights organization in the country. And it's co-founded by a man named Frank Kameny, whose papers are at the library, who I had the pleasure of knowing before he died in 2011 and interviewing him. And he was a Harvard-educated astronomer who was working for the Army Map Service right after Sputnik, right? This is the height of the space race. And he's fired for being gay. And he becomes the first person to challenge this. You have to understand, for years up to that point, hundreds, if not thousands, of gay people had been fired because of their sexual orientation. None of them wanted to challenge it, because to do so, you would have to come out and identify yourself as a homosexual. And to do that in the 1950s was death, really. And so Frank does this. And it's important to note, even the ACLU at the time would not take his case. That's how lonely the homosexual was in 1950s America. So he had to write his own legal briefs. He found the Mattachine Society. And then really, I think it's the arguments that Frank and the Mattachine Society make, very much like the civil rights movement, the African-American civil rights movement, appealing to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the founding documents of our country. That's the case that he makes, which I think is what ultimately prevails in establishing equality for gay people in this country.
And if I remember correctly, Jamie, in those arguments that Frank made to the Supreme Court, which didn't even bother to respond to his lawsuit, they just ignored it. But it was the first time that someone had used the Constitution and applied the promises and the ideals to gay people. Am I remembering?
Absolutely. No one had done it before then. And, Frank didn't have a legal background. He wasn't a lawyer. He did it really all himself. And it's pretty incredible. And I think that those arguments, those were the ones that would be used by the gay rights movement, more so than I think the activism that was happening in New York City at the time, or San Francisco, which was, certainly more colorful and certainly more maybe exciting. But, sometimes the slow, boring work of writing legal briefs and lobbying Congress and lobbying your elected officials, that's very important too. And also Frank had so many firsts, it's hard to keep them all in my head. He is also the first openly gay person to run for Congress, and he does it in DC in 1971, which is the year that DC gets its, non-voting delegate in Congress, still fighting to get representation. But he runs for that seat. He doesn't come close to winning, but it's a pretty big deal to have, an avowed homosexual, which is the term that they would use at the time, running for public office like that. And then in 1973, just 2 years later, he's instrumental in getting the American Psychiatric Association to overturn its classification of homosexuality as a mental disorder. And so I think these achievements are really important. And I'm not trying to, take away from what happened in Stonewall or what Harvey Milk did, but I don't think that this history gets its fair billing. And that's not to speak of, and then there's one more important point here too, which is that in 1975, the Civil Service Commission lifts the ban that it had on gay people working in the civil service, which had been implemented by executive order by President Eisenhower in 1953. And so with that action, Washington, D.C. basically becomes the first major municipality in the country to have an anti-discrimination statute on its books, because the federal government is the largest employer by far in the District of Columbia. And so Washington becomes something of a haven almost for gay people. You can work in any branch of the federal civil service that doesn't require a security clearance, of course. That doesn't get fixed until under Bill Clinton. But yeah, I think Washingtonians have a lot to be proud of when it comes to this.
So we've talked about Frank Kameny, and we're going to talk about a couple of other quote unquote characters who figure prominently in the book. But talk about quickly why you decided to tell the story of the secret city by administration, starting with FDR and ending with the Clinton administration.
So the reason I chose that time span was because if homosexuality was a condition that was considered a sin, obviously in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and a medical disorder, and you can see this being written about in all sorts of ways, and it's condemned in state legislatures and whatnot. What changes around the FDR era, really around World War II, is that homosexuality transforms from being just a sin and a medical condition to being a national security threat. Because America is now becoming a global superpower. It's building a massive bureaucracy to manage secrets and confidential information. And it's considered that there's no worse secret to have than being gay. And so the belief is that gay people will therefore be more susceptible to blackmail, and that they cannot be trusted in government positions because of this potential threat. So that's why I chose FDR. I mean, the book's introduction, I talked very briefly about, the speculation about Abraham Lincoln and other figures in our history. But it's really at that point, World War II, that homosexuality becomes this fearsome national security problem or issue. And I chose to end it with Bill Clinton in 1995, because that is when the ban on gay people receiving security clearances comes to an end. So it's not to say, gay history doesn't end in 1995. The closet doesn't go away, most certainly not. But what I call the specter of homosexuality that had been haunting Washington since World War II, it comes to an end officially by government fiat in 1995. Homosexuality at that point is no longer a prohibition to working in government. There would obviously be many more, issues relating to gay rights going on for decades after. But as you pointed out, the book is plenty long as it is, and I had to end somewhere, so I chose there.
So I'm glad you pointed out the fact that the homosexual became feared as a national security threat. And what ends up happening through these administrations is that we go through a cycle of sort of the lavender scare, there's gay panics within administrations.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is there's always this fear or feeling that there's this undercover cabal of homosexuals who are secretly running things.
Yeah.
Whatever is quote unquote bad happening in Washington, there must be gays involved.
Yeah.
Talk about why that's been a cyclical thing in Washington.
So I think anything that's secret is liable to be the subject of conspiracy theories. If you don't know about something, if you're ignorant of it, then it becomes quite easy to dream up these terrible things about it. And also, homosexuality was considered this terrible, terrible thing. It was unspeakable. In fact, one of the things I learned in this book are all the euphemisms that people would come up with to describe homosexuality because they couldn't utter the word. So during the first outing of a politician in 1942, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, it was a U.S. senator who was outed, David Walsh of Massachusetts. The Senate majority leader refers to homosexuality as a crime too loathsome to be mentioned in the presence of ladies and gentlemen, right? And so it's so awful and it's so terrible that you can't speak about it. And so during World War II, I came across all these government documents in which there is serious speculation that the Nazis are a gay cabal. Like, this isn't just something that was joked about in The Producers, the Mel Brooks musical. This was actually something that high-ranking officials believed in the OSS, which is the predecessor organization to the CIA. I found a proposal that reached their desk that was made to recruit, quote, patriotic homosexual men to.
I was going to ask you about that, Jamie. Keep talking.
Yeah, because gay men were banned, gays were banned from the military beginning in World War II. That's when that policy began. Of course, many of them served because the government needed any warm body it could get. But this proposal was made to the predecessor organization to the CIA. And it was just sort of in passing. It's like, because it's known that the Nazi high command is, riddled with homosexuals, we should recruit some patriotic homosexual men to infiltrate their ranks. And FDR was getting a stream of intelligence reports from some of his advisors about American businessmen returning from trips in Europe and reporting on, all these homosexual Nazis that they're meeting. And then just a few years later, when we've defeated the Nazis and we're fighting communism, all of a sudden, Joe McCarthy is making these associations between homosexuals and communists. And then after the JFK assassination, if anyone has seen the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, it was nominated for 5 Academy Awards. That movie is based on a real prosecution that the New Orleans district attorney in 1967, a man named Jim Garrison, he was alleging that there was a right-wing cabal of anti-Castro homosexuals who killed Kennedy in revenge for the Bay of Pigs. That's what JFK, the movie, is about. And then you have Anita Bryant a few years later, right? It's homosexuals are pedophiles and we have to save our children from them in school districts across the country. A message that is unfortunately resonating in many ways today. So yes, it's this recurring notion of conspiracy. It's very similar to anti-Semitism in that way, in that Jews and gays, they're kind of spread out all over the world. They're not loyal to their country. They have dual loyalties to some other entity. And I think what's also important in understanding this is that with gay people, you can't tell that they're gay, particularly in this era when everyone had to be in the closet. The fact that you can't spot a homosexual makes them very duplicitous. It makes them secretive. It makes them suspicious. And that, I mean, I would say the phenomenon of the closet lends itself to these conspiracy theories, because when you know that there is this population of people who are hiding, it becomes very easy to project onto them nefarious, evil motives. And so that is absolutely a recurring theme in the book.
The lesson here is that there was no gaydar back in the day. It was homosexuals, and it was homosexual communists. And on page 279, and this gets to one of the characters, and when I say character, this is a real person, but this person sort of embodies what Jamie's talking about. On page 279, he writes, "The problem with witch hunts is that you eventually run out of witches. And by the early 1960s, the elimination of homosexuals from the federal government was yielding fewer and fewer of them. But the fear of secret homosexual plots threatening American democracy was alive and well." And you talk about the Cuba connection, but then you go on to write about, on page 281, "If there was anything considered more threatening to the American social order at this time than a homosexual communist, it was a black homosexual communist." And that person was Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin, trusted aide of Dr. Martin Luther King, the architect of the 1963 March on Washington. Why was Bayard Rustin, why was, figuratively, a target put on his back by none other than Strom Thurmond? Why was he the target?
Sure. Well, I should say Bayard Rustin is really one of my personal heroes, and really one of the great moral figures of the 20th century, and is not as widely known. His legacy is not as widely known as it should be. He had been a communist in a previous life, and he became a very outspoken anti-communist because he believed that the communists in America were taking advantage of the African-American civil rights movement for their own purposes, and he becomes a democratic socialist. But of course, having once been a communist, it was, in terms of the eyes of a Southern segregationist like Strom Thurmond, you can never lose that reputation. So 2 weeks before the March on Washington, which he is organizing, Strom Thurmond goes down to the well of the Senate, and he has in his hand a police report from Pasadena years earlier, about a decade earlier, of an arrest record for Bayard Rustin for committing a homosexual offense, right? And it's important to understand at this point that, many gay men had criminal records because gay male sexuality was criminalized, right? So he had an arrest record. Strom Thurmond probably got this from the FBI. It's hard to know how a US senator from South Carolina would get an arrest record from something in Pasadena, California. And he basically outs Bayard Rustin on the floor of the Senate, although I should add that Bayard Rustin was relatively out for his time, and Martin Luther King knew he was gay, and the other leaders of the civil rights movement, they all knew that he was gay, but he was such an effective strategist that it didn't matter to them. And Thurmond denounces him on the floor of the US Senate. And it's kind of remarkable what happens, because the leaders of the March on Washington at that point, they could have fired him. They could have said, you know what, we have this really important event coming up in 2 weeks, and having this is a real distraction. But they chose to retain him. And this qualifies as being the first incident of a public figure being outed and surviving the charge. They retain him. He speaks at the march. He's one of the speakers at the march. He's on the cover of Life magazine afterwards. And he goes on to have a very illustrious career advocating for all sorts of issues, from Soviet Jewry to the Vietnamese boat people. And so this is what I try to do in the book, is sort of take these events, these personalities, these presidential administrations, these phenomena that we think we know about, right? And so there's been a lot written about the March on Washington, but there's a very other important element of this story that isn't as well known, and that I think contextualizes the March on Washington. It wasn't just a civil rights victory for African Americans. It was also, in this limited way, it was one for gay people too.
And you also write about Bayard Rustin not ever really denying that he was gay. You write, nor would Rustin deny that he was gay, a disposition extremely rare for men of his era, and among public figures so exceptional as to be virtually unparalleled. And then you have in parenthesis, in the words of one of his closest aides, Rustin, quote, never knew there was a closet to go into. So that was a quote unquote member of the secret cabal. I'm going to read you what is perhaps one of the best opening paragraphs of a chapter that I have ever read. It is chapter 33, and it is page 491. And I'm just going to read it, and then Jamie, you can fill in the rest. It was 3:15 a.m., 3:15 on the morning of June 26, 1980, and Congressman Bob Livingston was extraordinarily drunk, hiding in the congressional gym beneath the Rayburn House Office building, petrified that a team of highly trained, right-wing, homosexual assassins working on behalf of Ronald Reagan was about to kill him. I mean, come on. But this is true. Jamie,
Yes,
tell the story.
Yeah, so this is 3 weeks before the Republican National Convention. And Bob Livingston, who was probably most famous for his role in the Clinton impeachment, he was going to be Speaker of the House, but then had to resign that job when Larry Flynt exposed that he had had extramarital affairs himself. He had gone out to dinner that evening with a lobbyist for a kind of conservative right-wing think tank dealing with Latin American issues. And over the course of the evening, they were talking about Reagan's selection of vice presidential candidates, one of whom was Jack Kemp. And Jack Kemp had been rumored to be gay since going back to 1967, when he was working for Ronald Reagan. He was a professional football player. He spent the summer working in Ronald Reagan's office. And then later that year, Drew Pearson, who was an old-fashioned muckraking newspaper columnist, he used to wear a fedora, and his column used to be syndicated in the Washington Post. Although interestingly, this syndicated column was not published in the Washington Post, because in it, he alleged that there was a network of homosexuals working under Ronald Reagan in the gubernatorial office in Sacramento. And he doesn't name anyone, but he alludes to the fact that Kemp might have been one of these people. And this, the Washington Post published Drew Pearson's column for decades, but I actually found in my research, the rare instances they didn't publish his column was when he would engage in these sorts of gay conspiracy stories, right? These gay scandals. It was too much for them back then. So Livingston is talking, and he's concerned that Jack Kemp, who might be gay because he was involved in this scandal going back to 1967, might be the nominee. The evening is going on. He's drinking more and more with this man. He's giving him a ride home because the dinner partner has had too much to drink. And it's unclear if this guy makes a pass at him or if his hand just, touched him by mistake. Livingston freaks out. He drops the guy off. He speeds to the Capitol. He goes to the basement. He calls up one of his colleagues in the House, Pete McCloskey, who was a liberal Republican. And it turns out that McCloskey is also on this story of Reagan's gay aides. He has a friend who's been making allegations to him about men who's worked for Reagan over the years who were gay and made passes at him. Long story short, you can read it in the book. McCloskey brings these allegations to Ben Bradlee, the great legendary editor of the Washington Post. And Bradlee takes them very seriously, and he gets a team of his best reporters, including Bob Woodward, and they investigate this story of this supposed, right-wing gay cabal controlling Ronald Reagan. And he sends out these reporters across the country, and they interview a number of people. And it turns out that, yes, there were some gay men working for Ronald Reagan. No, it was unclear that there was any sort of conspiratorial element to it. And they decided not to publish a story about it. But I found the notes of all of this in Ben's papers at the University of Texas. And I felt that it was important to write about it now, because I think it shows you the degree. We're talking about, these themes of fear and conspiracy. And I think it's important to see, where this led, right? And the fact that a number of Republican elected officials were involved in this campaign, or in this attempt to get the Post to look into these allegations. The fact that Ben Bradley, who comes off very well in the book in terms of his judgment. There's a number of stories involving Bradley where he really shines. But I think it's important that people, read this and understand this is what Washington was like, that you could make an allegation like this, that a U.S. congressman would fear for his life, that the Washington Post would investigate allegations that might sound, crazy to us today, but they didn't sound crazy at the time.
I want to get to one more vignette before we open it up to questions, but I do want to read about the reporters who fanned out across the country to truly investigate these allegations. One reporter said, "Count me out until someone on this list of alleged homosexuals is actually serving in a presidential administration with access to national security information, or until a more current pattern of some group is evident." And this was also part of Ben Bradley's role back then, that the private life of public officials was off limits unless that private life impacted the person's work. But then you have here Boucher, I think, is one of the
he's the man who
was in the Mustang. So Lynn Boucher, so a Washington Post reporter, travels down to Texas to interview Boucher, the man in the Mustang who made the pass at Livingston. He writes, as Boucher described the events of June 25th and 26th, he reenacted for the reporter the moment that sent Livingston fleeing to the basement of the Rayburn building, grabbing Gup's, quote, knee and thigh firmly in a quick, unexpected action. And then in parentheses, the reporter writes, "His hands were strong. I thought, my God, if he grabbed Livingston that way, no wonder the guy spent the night in the gym." He was freaked out. Okay, one more thing, and this is a story that I did not know, and this is on page 648, and it's actually quite moving. It is. This piece begins by just pointing out a headstone in Congressional Cemetery where it says, "A gay Vietnam veteran. When I was in the military, they gave me a medal for killing 2 men and a discharge for loving 1." Whose headstone is that? And talk about what happened as a result of him being buried there.
Yeah, so that is the headstone of Leonard Matlovich, who was the first soldier. He was in the Air Force to challenge his discharge from the military, and he does that in 1975. He's on the cover of Time magazine, and one day he's visiting Paris later in the 1980s, and he's visiting a cemetery where Oscar Wilde is buried, and it strikes him that gay people don't really have any monuments to their people, unlike other people, right? There's no equivalent of what Jews or African Americans or other groups have. Gay people don't have that. And so he decides he wants to do something like that. And he has AIDS, so he knows he doesn't have long to live. And he's living in Washington, D.C., and he's visiting Congressional Cemetery in Southeast. And he wants to be buried there. And he decides to get a headstone as close as he can to J. Edgar Hoover. who's buried in Congressional Cemetery, who along with just a couple steps to the left, if you're facing Hoover's tombstone, is his faithful deputy, Clyde Tolson, for many years, right? Maybe they were an item. I'm very scrupulous in my research. I didn't come up with any evidence. I leave it to the reader to decide. But Matlovich chooses to have this very moving headstone placed right there. And then over the years, all around him, gay people purchase burial plots, so that if you go to Congressional Cemetery today, they actually have what is called a gay corner. And they say that this is the only such cemetery in the world that has something like that. And so I decided to end the book with that scene, because I thought it was very fitting that, here's this man who was really sort of terrorizing gay people for decades, who might have been gay himself, which is a kind of a recurring theme, right? Or sort of closeted gay people behaving badly towards others. And I thought that was a fitting way to end the book.
Yes, J. Edgar Hoover, surrounded by gays. You write, today some of Matlovich's neighbors include Frank Kameny, who we just talked about, the lesbian activist Barbara Giddings, a grandson of the founder of the Boy Scouts, the man who designed the Main Street electrical parade at Disneyland, the founder of a teleprompter company, a couple who met at the Chicken Hut while students at Catholic University in the 1950s, and Alan Locke, the Howard University philosophy professor, considered the father of the Harlem Renaissance. Jamie, before we open it up to questions from the audience, like I said, this is a hefty book, and is packed with history and information that we didn't know before, or we at least should know more about. What do you hope the reader takes away from this book once they've read it from beginning to end?
I just think the immense patriotism of gay Americans who, much like African Americans who fought in segregated units in World War II, were, serving a country that didn't treat them equally and that actually didn't want them. I mean, this was a government that was actively purging gay people by the thousands for many years. And yet gay people continued to serve, and they wanted to serve because they understood the basic values of this country better than the people who were supposedly upholding them, those values. So if that's like that's perhaps the one takeaway. If I had to choose one, it would be that.
I lied. I have one more question.
Okay.
Because as we're talking about this, these, gay panics, there's the fear of the homosexual, but there's also the ubiquity of the quote unquote sex scandal. And I keep thinking about, Madison Cawthorn, towards the tail end of his primary is like talking about secret orgies of members of Congress. You've got other members of Congress who are talking about teachers and other folks who are quote unquote grooming children. How do those two things and what we're going through now fit this cyclical pattern that you've written about in Secret City?
It's a very good question, and it is a recurring pattern. And I think it goes to this tendency in American politics to associate one's political adversaries with sexual deviancy. And I spoke earlier about fascism being associated with gay people, communism. What is QAnon? QAnon is basically, it's not necessarily homophobic, but it's all about associating your political adversaries with the worst possible thing, which is pedophilia. And so it just seems that for certain types of people in our political discourse, this is sort of the go-to. It's a very tempting weapon to use, is to associate your political adversaries with sexual degeneracy. But I have to say, I really believe that with Trump, I'm not sure that these attacks are going to be so frequent or so powerful as they used to be. Because when you have a guy with his sexually unorthodox life, let's just say, who's endorsed by evangelicals, Christian evangelicals, that kind of makes this an obsolete issue. I would like to think, because those people pretty much lost the ability to make the argument anymore, right? To use sex as a political weapon, I really do feel that it's lost its valence. I could be wrong, but that's what I see.
So we're going to open it up now to questions and answers questions from the audience, answers from you, Jamie. There are microphones on either side. Don't be shy. Just say who you are. Keep your questions short, and please ensure that they are questions and not too long. Otherwise, I'll have to interrupt you. Go right ahead.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm a public history student at American University, very fascinated in 20th century social history. I am just a little curious about, in your research and primary sources, did you see the same sort of moral panic and hysteria directed towards lesbians and gay women? I think a lot of this conversation's been, about gay men. I'm just kind of curious about your findings there.
It's a good question. There was, in the early years of the Lavender Scare, there were some allegations that there was a sapphic element to this, and that lesbians were being used to, I think the Russians were using lesbians to seduce other lesbians in the government. But the vast majority of this sort of homophobia that I'm writing about is directed at gay men. I think there's several reasons for this. One is just that male sexuality is seen, or male homosexuality is seen as more threatening, or you could say male sexuality is privileged more than female sexuality. Men were considered more important, right? This was a misogynistic, patriarchal society in America in the 1950s. And so what men were doing sexually was considered more important than what women were doing. You also have to take into account the fact that political power in Washington in this era was pretty much exclusively held by men, and white men for that matter. There were very few women in positions of authority. They're mostly working secretarial administrative jobs. The security clearances are held mostly by men. And so people with security clearances are subject to a higher level of scrutiny by the Civil Service Commission, by the FBI, right? So they're being investigated more than women are. Also, gay male sexuality was much more heavily policed than that of lesbians, right? So we spoke earlier about Bayard Rustin. Gay men in this era, many of them are seeking sexual partners in public parks and bathrooms. They're being arrested. They're being entrapped by the police. Lesbians are not engaging in that sort of behavior. So they're not coming into conflict with the law as much. Another factor is that it was in some ways easier culturally for lesbians to hide, in the sense that there's this concept called a Boston marriage, which was two women of a certain age who would live together. It was called a Boston marriage. They might be lesbians. They could just be two, spinsters was the one term somewhat derogatory used for that. But it wasn't necessarily that, two older women, adult women living together was not necessarily assumed that they were lesbians. Where, two bachelors living together, that's much more suspicious. You can't really call someone your roommate in your 30s or 40s without attracting attention. So for those reasons, female homosexuality just wasn't seen as much of a threat as male homosexuality was.
And Jamie, and thank you, Caroline, for your question. To the point about lesbians and they factor into the book, I want you to talk about the lesbian presidential aide so deeply closeted that she never came out, yet who organized the first meeting of gay activists at the White House. This was in the Carter administration.
Yeah, so Midge Costanza, who was a local politician in New York State, worked for Jimmy Carter as his public liaison. And very early into his administration, in March 1977, she hosts a meeting of gay rights activists at the White House, the first such meeting ever held. Carter was away that weekend, probably deliberately at Camp David. And this becomes very controversial. Outside the administration, Anita Bryant is launching her campaign against the anti-discrimination measure in Miami around the same time. And she points to this meeting as being a terrible, sign, right? That America is rejecting God, embracing homosexuals. And also within the Carter administration, what was called the Georgia Mafia, Carter's guys from his time as governor, they're more conservative. Midge is quite left-wing. They sort of use this against her within the administration. So that within a year and a half, she resigns. She had an office in the West Wing. They moved her into the basement of the old executive office building. She's gone, and she remains closeted her entire life. She was a lesbian. She actually was having an affair with one of the women who came to that meeting. But yes, that she's probably the most important lesbian in the book, I would say.
Question here.
Hi, my name is Jordan. So your book kind of reminded me a little bit of the 1619 Project, where Nicole Hannah-Jones, she centers African Americans in our experience. You center gay people and queer folks. I was wondering, why do you believe that marginalized communities embody what America is supposed to be? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I remember reading the essay that she wrote where she says this. She says that, I'm not going to quote it correctly, but she says something along the lines of Black Americans have understood the values of this country or have defended them more strongly than anyone else, in the sense that they maintained their faith in a country that enslaved and oppressed them for so long, and yet still held faith in that country. And that, writing my book, that resonated with me, because similarly, you have gay people who their existence is illegal. They are deemed medically defective by the medical establishment. They are condemned by religion and basically any sector of society. And yet they're still willing to fight and die and serve their country. And so they stand as almost sort of totems to towards the values that the country claims to uphold. And, really what I was trying to do with this book, I don't consider it a revisionist history. I was really trying to take what I saw as two threads. There's the main thread of American history that we all learn in school, in the textbooks, and you read in presidential biographies. And, we learn about the Red Scare. We learn about the Civil Rights Movement. We learn about Reaganism. We learn about Vietnam, right? But then there's this other thread that I saw of gay history and the gay experience. And I wanted to braid them together and to intertwine them and to show the ways in which they were connected.
Thank you, yeah. Wait, did you have another one? Oh, okay. I just wanted to be sure. I see that there's actually 4 microphones, 2 in each row. So you don't even have to leave from up there to come all the way down here. So don't be shy. Ask, Jamie, we have a question.
Hello, I'm Stephen, and I work for the National Park Service, and I was wondering, under the Obama administration, the Stonewall Bar was made a national monument, the only unit in the national park system that actually focuses specifically on gay rights and the gay rights movement. If you were to propose a monument in Washington, which was in line with your view that Washington was so central to the struggle for gay rights, what would it be?
That's a great.
Well, am I mistaken? I thought Frank Kameni's home was listed as something. Was it in the National?
On the National Register of Historic Places, but that doesn't make it a part of the national park system. There's 100,000 structures on the National Register.
Sure. Well, I have an idea, and it'd be interesting to see what would happen. But the first meeting of the Mattachine Society of Washington was in room 120 of the Hay Adams Hotel. And I think that meeting, it was an incredible event, the way I write about it. It was surveilled by the FBI. They were surveilled by the local police department. And it's funny, the FBI basically got the manager of the hotel to kind of snoop on it. And he reports back to the FBI that all that happened, it was, 16 well-dressed men. All they ordered was coffee. And all I could hear was bywords and resolutions, right? So it's not as exciting as Stonewall with, drag queens throwing bricks at cops. But I think that that's a really important event in not only gay history, but American history. And maybe they could put a little plaque outside room 120 at the Hay Adams Hotel.
I'm a little disappointed it was just coffee. I mean, I would have at least ordered a martini. They were in such smaller glasses back then. In the absence, I was pushing people to ask questions because I didn't want to dominate with questions of my own. I want to pull you away from the book for just a moment. One of the things that concerned me about the leaked draft opinion from Justice Alito that would overturn Roe v. Wade was, 61 pages of why Roe was poorly decided, why all these other, quoting dissents from other justices in cases like Loving, Lawrence, Windsor, Obergefell. And then on page 62, he writes, oh, by the way, what I've written for 61 pages only refers to and applies to abortion. Anything else, any other rights, don't worry. I then immediately wrote a column saying, I am scared to death because if Roe goes, then the rationale for Obergefell and Lawrence and Griswold, which I believe is the right to contraception, and other rights that we enjoy under the right to privacy are in danger. Am I being overly dramatic? Am I being, what's the word I'm looking for? Alarmist? Or is that a real fear that we should have?
Well, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I just keep that in mind. I'm not as concerned as you are for a couple of reasons. One, he was explicit that this reasoning that he was using would not apply. I also don't really see a majority on the court for repealing Obergefell. And I also think that, the court does take into account the issue of sort of public opinion in its decisions. And, public opinion on abortion has really not shifted a whole lot since 1973. And compare that to gay marriage, which has been the most dramatic and the swiftest change in public opinion on any social issue, I think, recorded by pollsters. So that gives me hope. But again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but I don't see Obergefell being repealed.
I'm not a constitutional lawyer either, obviously, but I want the court to give us its decisions so we can then plan and act accordingly. Because I won't stop being scared until I see what they do. We have about 5 minutes. Do I see 5? Oh, we have a question. Oh, here. Oh, that's what you're doing. You're signaling there's a question. I thought you were telling me 3 minutes. Thank you. Your question.
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear
Try to keep it under 3 minutes. My name is Wes Holloway. I just received my MFA in social practice with an emphasis in public policy at the Corcoran, which is now part of GW, which is kind of tying in art and public policy together. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you're using your art, i.e. literature, to reactivate the archives in a way that now the public can understand and be interested in these timely topics, and how you see your art form being that catalyst for knowledge and change.
It's a great last question. Thank you, Wes.
It's a great question, and it's totally different than anything I've been asked on this book tour, so thank you. And it's really meaningful to me because I felt very lucky getting to spend the past 2 or 3 years off Twitter, uh, where I used to spend a lot of time, and I'm spending a lot of time now because I'm promoting a book. But it was such a wonderful experience to not have to be plugged into that 24/7 on Twitter and just go to an archive and bury myself in these documents that no one had, seen or touched for decades, and to actually find new things in them. I think people think, oh, it's an archive, it's just old stuff. Yeah, it's old, but a lot of times no one knows about the material that's there. And the best material that I got in my book, I mean, I've shared some of it with you tonight, I unearthed in archives. And I really developed a love for archival research. I was a research assistant in college for an author who's writing a biography of William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of the conservative movement. And his papers were at Yale, and I was researching when Buckley ran for mayor of New York City in 1965. And it just transported me to a different world. And if you love history, there's really no better way to spend your time than in archives. So I can't speak highly enough about archival research. If you're a journalist and you want to do something different and you want to take a break from the hourly nonsense of Twitter, go visit an archive. You will find something interesting.
Jamie Kirchick, the name of your book is Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. Thank you very, very much for two things. For being here this evening, but also for writing this book that puts the LGBTQ community at the center of American history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.